quarterback, wide receiver, or running back to start at 109. I ran 3 mock drafts from the same spot in a 10-team Superflex, 3 wide receiver, half-PPR league to find out which strategy gives the best build. So team 1, running back first, hero RB. Again, all these are from pick 9. There's a chance I'll be picking from the 9 spot in our home league. If you didn't get a chance to check out our video on how we select draft order, it's a ton of fun, and I will drop that link in the comments. And as it stands, I do have a pretty clear tier of 9 players in 10-team Superflex. Those players being Josh Allen, Lamar, Daniels, Chase, Jefferson, CD, Saquon, and Gibbs. So I knew I was going to have access to one of those guys. Decided to kick things off with Jahmyr Gibbs. We know Jahmyr Gibbs. He's awesome. He's very consistent. I know sometimes he kind of gets molded into that boom bust type of player, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Like if you look at his lowest point total last year was 9.4 week 13 against Chicago. He gets plenty of opportunities in the red zone. Like Montgomery was 4th in the league in carries inside the 10-yard line, but Gibbs was 13th. So there's plenty to go around. We know this is one of the best offensive lines in football. Obviously, their center retiring does hurt a little bit, but 52 receptions in back-to-back years. And Monty missed 3 games each of the last 2 seasons. Gibbs averaged 25 half-PPR points per game over those games. I know that includes the week 18 blow-up game, but it also includes an 8-point performance week 3 of his rookie season. So again, just a complete monster and really a league winner if Monty is to miss time. Looking at the next running backs, again, this was a hero RB approach. Decided to go with Brian Robinson. So B-Rob, he got off to a hot start last year, was banged up quite a bit with injuries, but this is a team that's going to score a ton of touchdowns. They improved their offensive line with Larry Tunsil, and they didn't really add anyone to this backfield outside of a 7th round pick. Now, Najee Harris, as much as I want him to not be a factor in favor of Omarion Hampton, I do think he'll have a role, especially in the first month of the season. And with these 2 low-end RB2s, that's the easiest role to replace in your lineup, either via the waiver wire or trade. And then with Jaden Blue, not without his flaws as a prospect, but is an excellent pass catcher and brings much needed speed element to the Cowboys backfield. He ran a 4.38 at the combine, but he ran a 4.28 apparently at his pro day. So kind of a boom. I don't want to say boom bust because it's the last pick of the draft. Like you can just easily cut that guy and that might end up happening, but there is a decent pathway to success for him should he carve out a decent role. Now, the wide receiver position, I get 3 absolute studs like CD and AJ Brown, need no introduction. And with Ladd, I have him 1 spot behind Drake London and I have London 1 spot behind AJ Brown. And this is important because that mini tier of AJ Brown in London are the last wide receivers that I personally feel comfortable with as my wide receiver 1. Maybe foreshadowing a little bit here for a later build, but Ladd is my wide receiver 3. Like that's money in the bank. And then with Rashee Rice, I think he will continue to rise up draft boards as we continue to get positive health reports and confirmation that he won't be suspended, which is looking like it's not going to happen. So maybe not the most realistic pick, but you'll notice in Superflex how QB runs can really push other values way down the board. And then took DeVonta Smith only because in this scenario, he's a bench wide receiver for me, and already having AJ Brown, if either of those 2 were to miss time, the other's value completely skyrockets. And then with Ricky Pearsall late, this is actually one of my favorite picks, to be honest, because we know he had a strong finish to the season. He's an excellent route runner on an elite offense. We know Debo's gone. Ayuk is likely to start on PUP. And we don't know exactly how the Niners offensive situation will unfold. But there's just so much upside in this range. And I'm not usually a huge fan of stacking in redraft, but just because like if one guy gets hurt, it negatively affects the other player's value. But at the same time, I feel more strongly about that when it's like very early round picks versus, such a late round guy with Pearsall in this scenario. So there's just too much upside to ignore. And then at the quarterback position, Brock Purdy, he's a very safe pick. In Superflex, I would argue that he has a little bit more value because of that stability. And then with CJ Stroud, we know last season was a bit of a disappointment, but he dealt with a ton of injuries at the wide receiver position. He was going QB5 or QB6 last year at the time. So, I know we're kind of quick to forget that. And then hopefully, a lot of this is contingent on, the 2 rookie wide receivers to hit. And I think they will. I think they're both really fine players. I think they've done a really good job of replenishing this wide receiver room. So he has all the talent to finish inside the top 10 this year. And then at tight end, David Njoku, one of my favorite late round tight ends, his current ECR is tight end 10. I have him as my tight end 6. And again, this is just, assuming that Flacco's the starter, and we saw him go off with Flacco a couple years ago. Final thoughts on this team. I like this team quite a bit. I'm stacked at wide receiver, and as long as I can figure out my RB2 spot and the QBs finish inside of that like 10 to 15 range, like they're more than capable of, I think this will be a really tough team to beat when it's rolling. Second team, wide receiver first and elite tight end. So at the wide receiver position, starting off with JJ and Puka, I get 2 wide receivers in my top 4, which in 3 wide receiver leagues is really only something possible in Superflex, where QBs go in the first round. And then rounded out with DK Metcalf. He's got really no target competition whatsoever. Zero threat that Aaron Rodgers brings in Devontae Adams this time. And Rodgers supported Wilson and Adams last year. I know this is a run-heavy team, but they could set up some deep shots via play action for DK. And they paid him, right? $60 million guaranteed, 4 years, $123 million contract. That speaks volumes as to how they wanted to get him involved. And then with Chris Olave, he finished top 25 his first 2 seasons. I'm not in the camp that he and Carr were ever really on the same page or had a really strong rapport. So I'm not as nervous about the Tyler Shuck addition as maybe some others are. And with the addition of Kellen Moore, runs a very high tempo offense, which will help in terms of the number of plays. And of course, that helps when you've had better teams in the past. I understand that, but I do think he'll bring a spark to this offense. And then with Chris Godwin, we know what type of pace he was on last season. Now reports are saying that he's going to continue to play in the slot. And this is another player whose ADP I expect to rise a ton, assuming reports of good health. And then with Rome Odunze, disappointing rookie season. This is a projection bet based on talent and improving offense overall. Keenan leaves this team. He had 121 targets last year. I know they added a couple playmakers with the first 2 picks, or their first 2 picks in the draft, but all the underlying metrics for Rome were very positive last season, albeit the stats were not very good, but I know he's definitely a very popular breakout pick this year. And then at the running back position, I'm not sure you can call this hero RB or robust RB, but I got 2 RBs firmly inside my top 10 with Henry and JT. Now, this could fall apart if they get injured, but I did take what I hope will be a very high valuable handcuff in DJ Giddens. I liked him a lot as a prospect, but we'll see how the depth charts ultimately play out. And then with Charbonnet, I'm a big Ken Walker guy through and through, but we're already getting reports of an ankle injury in camp, and we know how productive Charbs is when given the starting role. I don't typically draft other people's handcuffs unless there's injury news heading into the season. I did this in a league last year with only 4 bench spots where I drafted Jordan Mason and the CMC owner didn't, and obviously that paid out. So we'll just be monitoring Ken Walker a ton throughout the offseason because he's someone I'm very heavily invested in best ball. Now, at the quarterback position, I get Dak Prescott and Trevor Lawrence. Dak catches a lot of flack as a player, but looking year over year, he was injured last season. In 2023, he was the QB3 in fantasy. He's injured in 2022. And in 2021, he was QB8. So a bunch of top 10 finishes in there. And I'm not expecting much rushing out of him this year, just coming off that injury, but this should be a very high volume passing attack that just added George Pickens on top of obviously CeeDee Lamb. And then for Lawrence, they bring in Liam Cohen, they draft Travis Hunter, we get Brian Thomas Jr. in year 2. Jags were last in the league in offensive plays per game. Tampa Bay was 9th. So again, hopefully the addition of Liam Cohen changes a lot of things. And this is really going to be the best offensive environment that he's ever had. So now it's time to step up and be that generational prospect or whatever everyone wanted to call him. And then at tight end, getting Trey McBride. Trey McBride is a monster, right? He caught 111 passes last year. Nothing really changed in this offense. I hope and expect them to shift more towards Marvin Harrison, but if McBride can just find his way into the end zone a few times, none of that will really matter. Final thoughts on this team. This is a strong team, but if Henry and JT do miss time and Ken Walker plays a full healthy season and Giddens isn't the handcuff I'd envision, this could get in trouble really quickly at that position. And I think it's important to call out at tight end that you should always practice mock drafting as many elite tight end teams as possible. And what I mean by that is that you're passing up on a very good player at another position and just see how you feel with those teams versus waiting, because this is always the time of year where waiting on tight end feels fun. There's so much depth at the position, et cetera, et cetera. And then the games start and you're just happy that you had Bowers or McBride or Kittle. All right, final team, QB first, robust QB. So this isn't a strategy I would recommend, nor have I ever done it, but I thought I'd give it a try and see how it worked out. I mentioned earlier that I think it's a pretty clear tier of 9 players that I want to go after. And Mahomes, who was my first pick in this draft, is not one of those players, but I did commit to doing a QB first start for one of these builds, and the big 3 plus Burrow and Hurts were already off the board. And, Mahomes and Baker, I do have as my QB6 and QB7. And I do have as a tier break after Baker, but you see such a drop off, especially at wide receiver compared to my other teams, that maybe if this was a 2 wide receiver league, I might give it more consideration. But when you're starting 3 and usually 4 per week, it can get tricky very quickly. And then at the wide receiver position, Ladd McConkey, I love Ladd, wide receiver 12 last year after a very home start, also exploded in that playoff game. They added Trey Harris to the outside. Ladd's advanced metrics were off the chart. Everything about him was just fantastic, but he's still just not someone I'm 100% comfortable being as my number 1. Again, I have high hopes for him, but that's just kind of how I have my guys tiered. And then at Cortland Sutton, he was the wide receiver 13 last year. It was the highest mark of his career. He had 81 receptions, but 8 touchdowns. This was the second time he's been in the top 20 at the position. Other than that, he's been in like the 35 to 50 range, and he's coming off 135 targets. And the next leading receivers were Devon Vele, Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, all under 60 targets. And Lucas Kroll was their leading target earner at tight end with 31 targets. And what I'm trying to draw up here is it was very heavily concentrated on Sutton. And, whether or not you view Marvin Mims as a potential breakout this year, he did have a hot finish to the season. Now they take Pat Bryant, wide receiver, in the 3rd round. Troy Franklin, maybe they get something out of him. They seem to like Bailey. And I think importantly, they add Evan Ingram should command a bunch of targets. We know they're going to target the running backs out of the backfield. So, to me, it just kind of feels like he reached closer to his ceiling last year. And I don't necessarily want to draft him at that ceiling. But given how I constructed this team, it's like, okay, well, at least if he can get up to that ceiling, like I need to kind of take that chance. And then Chris Olave, I talked about him before, but I think he could be in for a nice season. And Jacoby Myers and Calvin Ridley, I think, are in for solid campaigns as well. And then with Ayuk, I can likely start on IR and hope he comes back strong for the second half of the season. Now at the running back position, Etienne is a beast when Tua is on the field. 22.5 PPR points per game with Tua last year, 8.6 without him. So I really think he has RB1 overall upside in his range of outcomes. And I did take Jalen Wright as a handcuff. And then with Breece Hall, he's someone I'm a little bit hesitant on. We saw a volume drop off last season, especially in terms of targets. He doesn't get a ton of goal line work, but defenses are going to have to account for Fields rushing. So that should open up some lanes for Breece, but I'm just worried about the volume a little bit, especially the way that the coaches are talking about the other running backs too. And then with Travis Etienne, I think he's interesting to take a shot on, just given how low his ADP is. Like, we know Liam Cohen orchestrates an amazing run game and offense, and I think one of these guys is going to pop. I prefer kind of taking them here and there in best ball, and just because I can get them so late. But we'll see with him. We're only a year removed from him having an awesome season fantasy wise, but again, that was on heavy volume. And then at tight end, I locked in an elite tight end in George Kittle. So final thoughts on this team. Don't build your team like this. Even if I have Mahomes and Baker in a mini tier, am I that confident that they're going to be better than the combination of Brock Purdy and Jordan Love rounds later? Like, not really, to be honest. And when I say like rounds later, I don't mean like the ADP game that people talk about. I mean like just in general. So the only way I would ever consider starting QB in Superflex is, let's say you take Allen or Lamar at 1 and your league decides to just punt QB more or less in the first 2 rounds, and the top tier of wide receivers and running backs are all off the board that you had wanted and hoped for and planned for. And then all of a sudden, like Joe Burrow falls into your lap at the 2-3 turn. That's maybe when I would consider it, just to have this like massive positional advantage. So overall, let me know in the comments how you would rank these teams. And thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.